plants. Myself and my partner in 2019 took over ALCLA native plants, also known as ALCLA native plants. And this company was founded in 1992 by Dr. Alan Pat Fetkenhauer. They actually ran the business out of their backyard. So we are a small nursery, and we're still small, and we're working to expand slowly over time. It takes time, and of course the past few years have been interesting. But basically the nursery started with Alan Pat's passion and vision for growing plants native to Alberta, and they wild collected various species from southern Alberta, as north as Edmonton, as east as almost the border of Saskatchewan, into the foothills and down into the southern parts of Alberta, where we have some very unique biodiversity, particularly in the southwestern and southeastern corners of the province. So we wild collect our seeds sustainably. A lot of our collections come from side of the road and that kind of thing. We sell the seeds. We of course grow the seeds into plants, and we also offer consultation services to support people in making decisions about creating garden beds or a landscape or smaller restoration projects. So people choose to grow native plants because they do want to restore an area to native plants, or there has been disturbance due to some sort of industrial activity. We do sometimes supply some plants to those types of projects. Very often people are looking to create pollinator gardens. Schools, we often get requests from schools because they want to enhance the educational opportunities of the students and get them to understand local biodiversity. So there's lots of different reasons why one might choose to plant native plants, and I will go into more detail about that. So this is just a photo of myself and Ben. And on the right-hand side, you can see us at the nursery. So the nursery is located in Bears Paw, which is just outside of the northwest corner of Calgary, quite close to Cochrane as well. So first of all, what are native plants? If you're not familiar with them as such, native plant species are defined as those plants that were found on the landscape prior to European contact. After European contact, the land became quite heavily disturbed by various forms of human activity, agriculture being one of the largest in terms of decline of native prairie. So agricultural activity, industrial activity, different kinds of livestock husbandry may or may not degrade native prairie depending on native plant habitat depending on how it is, and that sort of thing, urbanization and that kind of thing. So, and then many of the plants that are planted, whether they be food crops or ornamentals for gardens, are not actually native to the area. So ultimately, native plants, they are these plants that have been there before, and they're really, really essential for all the wildlife that live on the land that we live on. So those wildlife include, native bees, right? Which don't include honeybees, and doesn't include mason bees. This was a new one for me. I have thought mason bees, I have lived on Vancouver Island where they are native. So I thought they were native. They're not native to Alberta. So native bees include bumblebees, sweat bees, and various types of bees. I'm not an entomologist, but there's great organizations out there like the Alberta Native Bee Council, which can provide tons of great info about that kind of thing. So butterflies as well, moths. Moths are very much in decline, and then their main predator, bats, are also in decline. Birds also very much in decline. So there's some various statistics out there. For example, in Alberta, we talk about the ecoregions. Let's start with that. The prairie ecoregion, there's considered less than 20% of our grasslands are remaining. So that's the grassland ecoregion. That's actually some of the largest pieces left on Earth. So native prairie is considered, in temperate areas are considered some of the most, some people say, some conservation organizations do say temperate native prairie is the most endangered ecosystem on Earth, and the least protected. And I think that's probably the piece that really makes this type of landscape so endangered. In Alberta, only 1.25% is protected by Alberta parks and other legislated protected areas. And that statistic comes from the Alberta Wilderness Association. And you can see, a lot of wildlife populations aren't necessarily monitored, but, there's estimates of 80% decline in insects and various native birds. So there's various numbers out there, again, because we're not necessarily population data 100 years ago when settlers first came. But these are just to give you an idea of the ecological concerns. When we remove the native plants, we remove the opportunities for the wildlife that depends on them to thrive. So that's a big piece. And other factors too, right? Grasses are actually massively important in sequestering carbon and mitigating climate change. So those are other factors. And one more thing I should say, I am from Calgary, so I talk a lot about our area, but in the Lacombe area, you are in the parkland ecoregion, and less than 5% of that ecoregion is remaining intact. So that means 95% of the habitat and the wildlife that depends on it have been impacted massively by human activity. So there's a real conservation piece in choosing to grow native plants, and I'll expand on that a little bit more. And the photo here is this blazing star, dotted blazing star. This is a photo we took when we were visiting Siksika First Nation a couple years ago. So thinking about our role here, I'm located in Treaty 7, and our role as treaty partners and settlers is something we think about a lot, and how can we do better to improve our relations with our First Nation neighbors, and native plants do also play into that as well. So, okay, so why grow native plants? So here's a photo of a Calgary home with some native plants. Of course, they're actually very beautiful. That's the first thing. There's incredible biodiversity. We have hundreds of species of plants native to Alberta in various different ecoregions, from prairie to montane to boreal forest. Now, of course, we can't grow every plant in every ecoregion. That's something to remember. Some plants are very versatile, and if we water them, they can do well. But we always encourage people to choose plants that do well in their ecoregion, or in a nearby or ecoregion that's similar enough. For example, a drought-tolerant area, that they can potentially do well on your type of site. So some of the benefits include they're adapted to local soil and weather conditions, so they can handle freezing cold winters, very hot summers, hail. You don't see these very broad-leaved, native species. They're well adapted to deal with the unusual weather patterns that we have. So hail, for example, in the foothills, we have Chinooks, which are very challenging for plants not native to our area. But native plants are adapted to that, and they do can survive through that. Another factor is the frost, right? So native species, we've had our native plants out for months, or not months, weeks, since almost the beginning of April, and it went down to -20, and some of them were already budding up and showing some growth. That didn't affect them. That didn't kill them. That didn't bug them. That didn't, it slowed them down. They stopped their growth, but they weren't negatively affected. So that's what the kind of thing you want. You don't have to worry about covering them, protecting them, bringing them indoors. So there's a lot less effort. There's a lot less maintenance. If you choose plants that are suitable for your site, they're very, very low maintenance, just a bit of weeding. Once they're established, no water requirements. And as we move into situations where water resources are limited, and that becomes an issue, it becomes important that we find ways to support that water conservation. So, and of course, they have built a relationship over thousands of years with native pests. So they are often resistant to, and obviously there's variation between species, but you're going to find they're resistant to a lot of different types of pests. But again, some species more than others. Many of our species can be deer resistant. We get that question a lot, or deter hares from certain areas. So they can be incorporated into the garden in that way, utilizing their unique properties. They have a way longer bloom time, right, from compared to introduced horticultural species. Remember, introduced species, they might be from other parts of North America, and they're often also from Europe and Asia. So they're very different from the plants that are actually native to our area. And so when you have those long bloom times, so some of our plants were blooming in mid-April, even a little bit earlier, like the shrubs in particular. Willow started, some of the pussy willow started quite early, probably first week of April. Then we got that cold weather and they stopped. And then, and I'll show you photos of many of these plants. Our buffalo berries as well, very early flowering, and that's essential for native pollinating insects, especially early bees. I've seen some hoverflies out already, butterflies and so forth. We're getting quite a lot more insect activity now. But if you're looking at supporting beneficial insects to the garden, which also provide very important pollination services for food crops, for example, then you want to have native species to support them. Native bees really struggle in the early spring and late fall because there tends to be much fewer food resources available. You're going to be seeing so many more birds and different types of wildlife in your gardens if you start choosing to plant native species. It's quite dramatic. There are studies on that as well. There was one study that showed as few as 10 plants are required. So once you have 10 plants, it significantly increases insect biodiversity, and each additional plant, up to 20 in that particular study, significantly increased insect biodiversity. So yes, support wildlife. They need our help. And so we can also preserve species in decline. And there's different schools of thought around that. But at the end of the day, when we lose habitat, we lose rare species. And if we do not cultivate or replace those rare, without cultivation, we can't replace many of those rare species or any of them. So we can also support species from going extinct and help them survive. So there are critical environmental issues that we can contribute to in our communities. We can provide great educational opportunities for youth and children to appreciate the incredible and beautiful biodiversity we have in Alberta. We can restore habitat. We can reduce the spread of invasive species as well. Many of our native species, again, depending on what we choose to plant where, are very capable, very disturbance tolerant, can be very strong and tough. So they can help to outcompete aggressive invasives like creeping bellflower, for example. You can choose native species that will do well in an area and help to push out and help you to remove those undesirable species from an area. And yeah, they are very beautiful. And I'm going to be highlighting all the different ways they are beautiful and the vast different types of growth forms one can appreciate with our native species. But before we get to the specific species, I'm going to just show you a few photos. So this is actually Alan Pat's place a couple of years ago, and so they did their front yard in native species, and they leave it kind of wild looking and give it a wild aesthetic. You can make more formal gardens, of course, with native species, and it's always dynamically changing, of course, because seeds will spread and fall, and some plants creep along. So you can see some beautiful blue flax, which is a late June and early July flowering plant. We have some northern goldenrod in the front. There's some shooting star. Those are very beautiful, lovely plants shooting in the back. So those are some ways we can arrange plants in that garden. Here's a garden again in Calgary, in a neighborhood called Britannia. So this was after, so this will be, this would be something like your second year of install, right? And I will explain what to expect in your first year of growing native plants in your first couple of years. But you can see there's some lovely, it looks like blanket flower in the back, really beautiful prairie species, some fringe sage. So you can get very interesting different dynamics with growing this species. They put a lot of brown-eyed Susan. We do carry a couple plants native to Saskatchewan, black-eyed Susan. Black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia hirta is what I'm referring to, is it's actually native to Saskatchewan, but has become introduced into Alberta. So we do carry a couple species like that native to Saskatchewan that have come in or are of significance that we will carry as well. And that's one of the former staff members of ALCLA. Here's a green roof that Al and Pat participated in. This is one of my favorite projects that they worked on. It's still ongoing. It's a private green roof, so it's not accessible to the public. But because native species are so drought tolerant and can handle adverse conditions, they are a good candidate for these types of green roof projects. And of course, there are many benefits too in choosing to grow green roofs. But anyways, how they started was actually grids of native grasses and wildflowers, and then over time they intermingled and seeded and became a facsimile prairie. So I mean, we cannot replace prairie. Prairie takes thousands of years to evolve. It was evolving with the presence of the bison, which are no longer on the landscape, and various other factors. However, we can create facsimiles that again help to restore different aspects of our wild spaces and our ecological communities, if you will. And this is one of my favorite success stories. This photo actually is from the City of Calgary blog. And on the right-hand side here, you see that white bee is a gypsy cuckoo bumblebee. In 2014, this species was federally regulated as endangered in Canada. This species is actually a parasitic bumblebee, which I had not ever heard of before until I heard about this particular bee and the success story. And so I think that's really cool. So the queen actually goes into another queen's nest, does away with the former queen, puts her scent everywhere and tricks the new workers into caring for her eggs. I think so she must replace all the former queen's eggs with her eggs. And so it's a really unique association. And there are so many fabulous, beautiful, complex relationships like this in our native ecosystems that are underappreciated, understudied, and represented. And these types of unique relationships, I think, really are even more at risk. So the more interdependent species are on each other, the more at risk I think they are at being able to survive disturbance. So the exciting thing is the City of Calgary put in a pollinator boulevard on Canyon Meadows Drive, if you're familiar with Calgary, and they just put in some wildflowers and grasses. And within a year of putting in that boulevard, right? So that means you're not mowing, you're allowing insects and wildlife to actually thrive, right? If we mow a site over and over, we're not allowing those kinds of spaces to exist. And they found this bee, and it was super exciting. So this super rare bee suddenly appeared, and it just shows how, it's anecdotal, but it indicates how quickly wildlife can recover if we just give them space, and if we just give them what they need, the food sources that they need to thrive. So so this, it's really exciting. Many cities now are taking on the initiative of becoming bee cities, ambassadors for pollinating insects that really do need our support to thrive. So that's my intro there. So now I'm going to talk about some specific, so just growing native plants. So you can start, of course, native plants from a pre-grown plant. Now we sell our plants in plug containers, and this comes from a tradition of, the company was started with the goal of providing native plants for restoration projects. And so, but there are many benefits to using a plug, but they're very well suited for outplanting. So the idea of the design of the plug is you get a very well-developed root system that isn't root bound because of the shape of the container. So you can then immediately plant those out, and they're designed to be planted and then never cared for. So perhaps a remote mine site that needs to be restored, we can put out these plugs. Not all of them will survive, of course, but if we plant them in the right season, we get enough precipitation, the roots are deep enough as is that they can just survive. We don't have to do anything. So there is that potential in the plug container, and we can carry on that legacy. It's fabulous in a small space. We do operate in a small space. So it allows us to carry thousands of different plants in a small area. And again, the advantages of having the deep roots was really fabulous and really helpful for anyone wanting to plant native species. And so what you're seeing here is a picture of fringe sage, and on the right-hand side is the second year of growth. So it does take the first year of any time we plant a perennial species. Most of that energy is going into the roots. So you're not going to see a lot of above ground growth. Above ground growth is always proportional to below ground growth. So we may think plants aren't there. They're dormant, right? They're real. The part of them that persists all year is those roots. It's the part we don't see, it's underground. So in the first year, they're really developing those deep, deep roots that in the second year you can see. So starting from a tiny plug, you won't get a lot of growth in most plants typically in the first year, depending on the species, but second year, quite dramatically, you will really see your plants fill in. So something to be aware of. We do recommend mulching. We recommend a montane mulch or a straw mulch around your plugs to reduce weed invasion until those plants fill in. But you know, we other than that, we don't really recommend any soil amendments. We really say work with what you've got, work with the native soil that you have. You can, you know, mulch on top will over time degrade. There's lots of different thoughts on different types of soil amendments, but many native plants are adapted to poor soil, nitrogen fixing legumes. They love it. They don't want to be fertilized. They don't want a bunch of compost. They really like that, those poor soils. And so we can plan and map out how our succession over time. We can plan our garden over time, and we can utilize the properties of native species to enhance and enrich soil. So yeah, and then, you know, if you are interested in planting a pollinator garden, and again, many of our clients are really keen. That's one of the top hot sellers right now in terms of ideology, is we want to grow a pollinator garden. And again, lots of organizations are starting that. The David Suzuki Foundation has a butterfly wave project. If you haven't heard of that and are keen to support native butterflies, check it out, because they do support people with those types of initiatives. But you know, you want to choose, if you want to make a pollinator garden, you want to choose a range of colors and flower types. So some flowers have a deep nectary and some have a shallow nectary. You want to have bloom times from at least late, you know, early May at least to late August, September. So long bloom times. And you would think about what the different pollinators need. So some bumblebees like to nest underground, so leaving patches of bare ground will allow them to actually be safe. You want to leave areas of your garden untouched, really. That's ideal. So we say don't do your garden cleanup until May 21st, but in reality, there are going to be species that emerge even later in the season than May 21st, so you know, the long weekend. So, you know, that's why we say leave a certain portion of your yard always untouched, you know, let leaves and other things fall naturally, and that will really allow overwintering insects to be successful and to survive in your garden environment. Here's again a picture of the plugs. Again, just coming back to that, you can see these grooves along the plugs. Those are the grooves that prevent the plugs from being root bound, which, you know, contrasts with other, like a conventional pot where roots can be bound. When we do plant plants like this, there is no transplant stress because we don't have to reduce, we don't have to damage the roots in any way. So right away, once you plant them, the plant starts growing immediately. And you can see we always want to see that the roots have fully filled into the plug before we sell them. And we do recommend, of course, watering in plugs and keeping an eye on them in the first few months, especially until they get established, just to make sure they establish successfully. Now you can also grow native plants from seed. So we do sell seed packets, and for some species, we do offer bulk seed as well. When seed is being collected by hand and hand cleaned, it is very labor intensive, so it's not cheap. We do also order in seed from reputable suppliers. So there are people in the United States as well. We prefer Canadian vendors, but sometimes we have to go to the US that do field grow a number of native species. So we may purchase from them in order to provide the bulk quantities people are asking for at an economical rate. So when you're seeing wildflowers, something to be mindful too, you know, a lot of times when people sell wildflower mixes in a conventional garden center, they're not necessarily native just because it says wildflower. So pay attention to what's actually on the list and learn about where you live, your ecoregion, learn about what plants are native to Alberta, and that will really help you and making decisions. A lot of times wildflower mixes will contain European plants or even weeds sometimes. So that's a real concern. So unless the person producing the plant has an ethical reason to actually care about, about what's going on in Alberta, there isn't necessarily, there's a real disconnect in what's being marketed in terms of seed. But anyways, so seed is cheaper, generally speaking. Of course it is, even if you pay a lot for a bulk seed. If you manage to grow 10-20 plants from that, and it was a gram, you're still saving money than if you were to pay for the plugs, right? Or the plants from a vendor. So that can be a benefit for some people, the economical nature of it. And of course, you learn a lot. It's a wonderful educational experience. Our seeds are so complex and biodiverse, and we're constantly learning and failing. So that's the downside, is learning and failing as well, right? So it's harder. A lot of seeds need unique treatments like cold stratification. So cold stratification is where the seeds need to experience the cold temperatures to break dormancy. So that's a natural adaptation to temperate regions. So in a temperate region, the seed, it's so intelligent, right? Seeds are alive, right? So they're so intelligent. So they can monitor, they can sense and know. They're waiting for winter to pass, which is a really smart adaptation, right? Because I don't want to germinate in a warm spell in January and then it gets really, really cold again and I wasted all this energy and I'm not going to grow. So they're waiting for a safe period of time to have passed. And in some cases, some seeds will wait several years, as much as 7 years before they'll germinate. And that can be a real challenge as a grower. We want to support biodiversity and genetic biodiversity, but we also logistically can't always keep seeds around for 5 to 7 years. So there's different challenges involved in maintaining the integrity of the plants themselves and their wild natures, if you will. So there are challenges, right? Scarification is a fairly easy, straightforward treatment, but depending on the plant can be challenging. So scarification is where you abrade the surface of the seed coat. So some seeds have a very thick seed coat. Legumes are a great example. And so if you've ever soaked your beans or your peas, pea plants overnight, that's a form of scarification. We're allowing the sort of engorging that seed coat with water so it breaks more easily. We will abrade it with sandpaper. There's other forms out there like acid scarification, and even hot water can be used for a few species that are adapted to that have a very, very thick coat and are adapted to survive fires, for example. Those type of seeds might appreciate a hot water bath, or we actually use boiling water for some species. So, there's a lot that goes into it. I've had a real struggle lately growing Indian ricegrass, the Acantharum hymenaoides. And, I was reading, again, most of the info is coming out of the US, and it can vary, right? Just because the same species in the US is the same as here, it doesn't always mean that they respond the same way, but in any case, one study even recommends aging the seeds for 5 to 7 years before stratifying them for 6 to 10 months. So there's a lot of species like that are very involved. So that can be, again, the challenge. Some of these really beautiful, unique species are incredibly challenging to grow from seed. So those can be downsides. There are also seeds that are super easy to grow from seed, and I will provide some examples of those as well. But in any case, what we do recommend in general is that you start your plants in a container, reduce all the variables. So if you want to direct sow in the ground, that's fine, but plan for way more seeds, because seeds will fail for various reasons. They may get eaten by wildlife. They may not get the frequency of watering might not be quite right. There's so many factors. Fungi might get at them because, outside soil isn't sterile, isn't clean, whereas a commercial medium should be fairly sterile, right? So those are all factors. So we suggest starting a container to reduce all those different number of things that can go wrong. And you want to keep the seeds, you want to make sure there's really good seed to soil contact. Some very small seeds should be sown on the surface. Larger seeds should be sown deeper down in the ground. But either way, there should be really good seed to soil seed seed to soil contact. You can see in this baggie here, that's showy aster, and anything with a pappus, we don't remove the pappus. You will get commercial products that remove the pappus, but that does slightly abrade the seed coat. So it does reduce the longevity of the seed in storage. So we do not remove, we don't bother to remove the pappus, but that makes it more challenging to integrate and really get that good seed to soil contact. So you'll really have to work seeds like that in to make sure that the fluff isn't at the bottom and the seed isn't sticking up in the air, which very often happens. So that's really important. And another thing is you need to keep consistently moist. So unlike plants that have been, when plants are cultivated, we select for them based on human desires. So we select for seeds that germinate quickly because no one wants to wait 3 years for their seeds to germinate. As a native plant grower, I want to try and see as many seeds through as I can because I want to support that genetic biodiversity. That being said, but because native plants haven't been bred by human beings, it can take 3 to 6 weeks or more for the seeds to germinate, which is, I think, a real challenge. So anemone patens are Prairie Crocus is a very iconic, one of our very popular native species, a species that needs help because it doesn't seem to spread into disturbed areas. It's only found in intact sites. So, but it just grows really well in a garden. So we want to plant Prairie Crocus, but to grow from seed takes 6 to 8 weeks before they start germinating. That means you can't go on vacation for a week and come back and think that your seeds are going to be fine. You need to be keeping that top inch of soil consistently moist for that long. So those are challenges, not to discourage. We always have lots of clients that are successful with their seeds and they send us photos and it's always exciting to see, but it's inevitable that there are failures because of the different challenges associated with growing them. So it's a fun, wild adventure. So those are the 2 ways you can grow native plants. You can either buy them from a vendor or grow them from seed yourself. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a range of different native plant species. This is the video I had at the beginning. This is Rocky Mountain bee plant, a very beautiful, prolific annual species. So we do mainly focus on perennials at our nursery, but there are, of course, native annuals, and this is one of our most beautiful. And you can see the native bumblebee was really enjoying the nectar. Now, the nice thing about annuals is they have an incredibly long bloom time. So annuals are plants that only live for 1 year. But because of that, they maximize as much as they can. So they'll start blooming we started these early, so they bloomed a little earlier, probably beginning of June, but all the way, until the end of summer, they were still blooming and they get these very elongated seed heads. You can kind of see on the left-hand side, they have these little fruits. They look a lot like mustard fruits and or legume fruits. They're very similar, right? It's actually in the caper family, but very closely related to mustards. So if you're familiar with the way mustard flowers grow, they have indefinite growth basically. So the youngest flowers at the top, and as long as the conditions are right, the plant can keep flowering for months. So that's excellent for pollinators and also for the fabulous beauty of your garden. Now, they don't need irrigation, but where we had them was a site where they were inadvertently getting irrigation. So because of that, they got very large for us. This is the photo on the right-hand side is from our garden last year. And they have come back. So the thing is, we collect a lot of seed and we also let a lot of plants go to seed and they replace themselves. So even though annuals only live 1 year, as long as you leave seeds on the plant, you're very likely to get seeds the next year. Now, this is a species that does require cold stratification. So it works great. You leave them in the soil and then they come out the next year. So very lovely, beautiful species. And they've been so tenacious. They were germinating before the snowstorm hit and they survived it. And my partner, Ben, was saying, I have never seen a seedling survive that kind of snow. So we're very impressed with the bee plants. Monkey flower is another annual. Now, this one is much easier to grow, but they do like a little bit more moisture or perhaps a part shade environment in the garden. They have absolutely itty bitty tiny seeds like specks of dust. So a little goes a very long way. We do offer this plant as a seed or as a live plant, but yeah, again, these plants, this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying a deep nectary. So plants that have a deep nectary, butterflies or bumblebees are types of insects that have the types of mouthpart modifications that can access deep nectaries. Not every insect can do that. And so again, they also have quite a long bloom time. We'll also you can also cut off the flowers on annuals, and then it will extend their bloom time even longer. These plants do really well in a pot. And I would love to see this type of annual being planted in planter pots, as well as some of the introduced annuals that are being planted. So there's pink monkey flower as well. And then we have our prairie crocus. I already talked about a little bit. So this is again one of our earliest blooming plants. They're already blooming from my understanding. And again, they're found in mainly in intact grassland areas. I've never seen them outside of a sort of native prairie remnant, which is a real concern, right? And I've also read a study, and that was an American study that looked at brome grass, where we have a really big problem with brome grass invading. The study showed that prairie crocus trends towards extinction if there's too much brome grass. So that was a really interesting study. So it's showing how these introduced grasses actually are potentially contributing to the decline of some of these native species. So more reasons why we really have to pay attention and put care into our native plant landscapes to ensure their survival long-term. They also form mycorrhizal associations with neighboring plants. So that can be again, these unique, beautiful associations can be factors that limit their ability to survive disturbance. So again, with a little bit of help, we can help to restore these beautiful plants. They are so pretty, and again, so vital for early insects. They're so cute and so fuzzy, and they have a long longevity. They live a long time, and we've had a lot of feedback from clients that we've had them for 10 years and they're doing so well, and it's spread and gotten bigger and bigger, and it's really exciting to hear that kind of thing about the prairie crocus. They do like full sun and well-draining soil conditions. Another early flowering plant comes right after the prairie crocus is the golden bean. This is one of our native legumes, quite easy to grow from seed. If you're keen to try your native plant growing skills, try a legume. There tend to be, the vast majority of them are easy to grow from seed because they just need a bit of scarification, whether you soak them overnight or whether you abrade their seed coat a little bit. They are quite easy to germinate. They germinate quite quickly, usually within 1 to 2 weeks. So that's quite fast for native plant standards. And yeah, they're quite lovely. So they do spread. So they do spread by underground rhizome. So you wouldn't want to put them in a tiny garden bed unless that was the only thing you wanted in a tiny garden bed. They do like more space, but you can see they're really fabulous for early pollinating insects. They also have a deeper nectary and they're nitrogen fixing. So any of our legumes do associate with rhizobium bacteria. So that's a type of bacteria that lives in the roots of the plants and takes atmospheric nitrogen and converts that to a usable form of nitrogen. So it enriches, enhances the fertility of your soil. So I always recommend incorporating legumes into a planting to help to improve the soil conditions for that plant and for neighboring plants. Another early flowering plant. This is more of a montane or like not alpine, but yeah, further higher elevation, the Alpine forget-me-not. But they do really well in a garden environment, and they do, once established, do not require additional irrigation. They are a shorter-lived perennial, so we always recommend letting them go to seed and they will replace themselves. They don't need cold stratification to grow from seed, so you can also collect your own seed from the plant and grow them. We very often get requests for seed for this plant, but it's such it produces so little seed that we're not able to at this time sell seed. One flower supposed to produce 4 seeds only, but often seeds an ovary will fail, so you'll get less than 4 seeds per flower, and so it makes it very challenging to collect seeds from this particular species. But it's very, very beautiful, and a beautiful, beautiful shade of blue with that yellow dot in the middle. Many people are already familiar with Alpine forget-me-not. Some other early flowering species: early blue violet and Larkspur violet. You can also eat the flowers. Larkspur violet is actually a rare species in Alberta. It was a seed that was donated to our company, and then we've kept it going. And then they also have deep nectaries. You can see from I think you can see my mouse there. The nectar is quite far back. There's almost a spur on the back of the flower. So again, and then you can see those hairs on the front. So those hairs are directionally pointing the insect to go in one direction so that they go straight to the back and find the nectar and don't get mess about too much. So I always find it so interesting, these different adaptations. You can see the dark lines on the lower petal. Those are actually like a landing strips, so saying, oh, stop here, land here, and you can get some nectar. Early blue violet flowers in May, and then Larkspur violet shortly after. Early blue violet has a very broad range of conditions, from prairie to higher elevation environments, and quite a very broad range. Very drought tolerant species, and they do slowly spread out and can make cute, beautiful little clumps. The Larkspur violet is a prairie species, so it does like that really well draining soil as well, and full sun. They're both full sun species, so they tend to actually, I would say early blue violet can do more part shade as well, but they're sort of adapted to come up, before other plants leaf out. So they do get quite a bit of sun early on in the season. And another cool factor about violets is that they're cleistogamous. That's a big word. What that means is that they produce flowers that don't open, but that they self-pollinate themselves. So you get seed pods of this plant all season long. You pay attention to them, they're so cool. They pop open, literally pop, and projectile throw their seeds at various distances. So they're really cool. This is another plant that doesn't produce a lot of seed. As I said, we're basically collecting seed by hand all season long, so it's very labor intensive, just a little bit at a time. But that being said, they do require also cold stratification to germinate the seed. Wild blue flax. So this is becoming a very popular species, at least in the Calgary area, for the municipality is planting. Again, really trying to promote more native wildlife. This is a late June, July species. They're so pretty. When you see a field of wild blue flax, it is absolutely breathtaking and gorgeous, in my opinion. They are perennial, so they come back year after year. Do be careful. There are substitutions sometimes with European blue flax, and again, it's not the fault of the vendors. It's people don't know, or the difference between the two is very minute. Often you'll see substitutions for Linum perenni, and the difference between this and our native Linum louisii is like the stamens, the pollen bearing organs are different sizes. So it's very, very similar. But from my experience and what I've observed, I think the native one is much more it's better suited for our climate and persists a lot longer than the introduced one. So just something to be aware of. There are substitutions like that happen, especially when seeds are being sold, like farmed and sold and exported and all these things. There are things get lost in translation. So that's why, again, it is really important to ask questions and make sure you know the source of where the seeds and plants are actually coming from. But otherwise, a really lovely plant, very closely related again to the commercial flax that we get flax seed from. So you'll see the seeds are very similar, and they smell just like flax seeds. So, and of course, they would be edible as well. So yeah, very, very lovely native species. Some more native legumes. I love the prairie clovers. We have the purple prairie clover and the white prairie clover. They have more of a shallow flower, which is very, not that common in temperate legumes. So they're very pretty. And the yellow especially the purple. They're both very lovely, but the purple is quite often a favorite because they do have that contrasting orange stamens with the purple petals. It's very beautiful. They're both nitrogen fixing clump forming plants. So unlike the golden bean, they won't be spreading around. And they're also utilized as forage or to supplement, people are planting them out in areas where, maybe there's grazing activity to improve the diversity of food. So they are quite nutritious and edible in that form as well. And they are summer blooming plants. Some shade-loving plants are our columbines. We have 3 species of native columbines in Alberta: blue, red, and yellow. And they do hybridize, so that's the interesting thing about them. They mix, they definitely get mixed up, and insects will go from one to another. And this has been a challenge in running the nursery, is just keeping things straight, because unless the seed has been collected from a wild source, then the next year you'll get a mix of red and blue or yellow and blue. So it's quite interesting. They are plants, they're shorter lived perennials, and they do like, they can do dry to moist, but you're typically seeing these in the understory of a forest or near woodland. So they are wanting a bit more moisture, so something to think about. So more shade, more moisture, they will prefer that type of environment. But again, they do really well. If you've got a nice garden bed, part shade, you don't need to irrigate them. We don't irrigate them once established, and they're so pretty. If you're looking to attract hummingbirds to your yard, plant columbines, or currants and gooseberries is another species that hummingbirds like. They love those deep nectaries. You can see the crown of the columbine. That's the nectaries at the very end. So they're really designed for insects to get right in there, or birds to get right in there and really pollinate them. So they're quite lovely. Anything else I want to tell you? Oh yeah, the seeds do also require cold stratification. So again, these are prolific seed producers. So one flower can produce hundreds of seeds. So let them go to seed, and you'll get new plants in future years once the more mature ones die back. So when you have plants like that are annual or short-lived perennial, it's really worth taking the time to observe and look closely at your plants and get to know them, because you want to be able to recognize those first seedlings that come up. Absolutely, that can be the challenge, is accidentally pulling out your new seedling when in fact thinking it was a weed. So those are definitely gaps of knowledge. So we want to pay attention as much as possible. Showy milkweed. This is a species native to the southern part of Alberta, basically Fort McLeod, further south. But people do want to plant it a lot because it is, milkweeds are the exclusive host of monarch butterflies. Now, in reality, if you're in Lacombe, I wouldn't necessarily plant showy milkweed for monarchs, because it's very unlikely that they would migrate that far north. They're very likely they'll migrate as far north as where I am in Calgary, but it's theoretically possible. But I mean, the further north you go, the less likely, it's very unlikely that the monarchs will migrate that far. So just be realistic. If you're wanting to support specific pollinators, make sure those pollinators actually live in your area. That being said, milkweeds are very drought tolerant, very tenacious plants, and they're beautiful. They're just so beautiful with these massive pink, baby pink flowers. They have deep nectaries again. So they are going to be still supporting butterflies, moths, and other types of organisms that want that type of flower shape. And you can see the seed pods are really unique, really unique. And they do like to spread their underground rhizomes. So, they can get quite large, 5 feet tall, maybe not 5, say 4 to 5. I haven't seen them much taller than that, but they can get really quite full. But if there are not native to your area, like your ecoregion, they may not go to seed, and that's something that we find. Like, in Lethbridge, they're prolific because the growing season is a little bit longer there than where I am, and they like that. They like the warm. They're a plant that comes up later. I had a client today complaining, I think my milkweed's dead, but they actually don't really emerge until late May. So some plants are like that. they want certain temperature conditions before they'll even emerge from underground. Some species will even skip years, right? If it's a very dry year and you haven't irrigated, like last year, many plants actually didn't even come up at all. So in the wild I'm talking about, right? Or didn't flower. So, different wild conditions will certainly impact, or I would say climatic conditions, if you're not supplementing with water and so forth, will certainly affect the performance of your plant. There's nothing wrong with that, and that's just recognizing that these plants have fabulous genius adaptations to the conditions in which they live. And you can observe that. So there's no need to panic, is what I'm trying to say. If something weird happens or your plant has disappeared for a year, it's not always the worst outcome. Fringe sage and prairie sage. So these are both sub-shrubs, and I will show you a few more sub-shrubs. These are both really great aromatic species. They are also really culturally significant for Indigenous people in Alberta who have historically lived here and have moved and live here now. So we do also get a lot of clients specifically planting these plants for that reason, as well as sweetgrass. So fringe sage is a clump forming plant, and prairie sage does spread. They both like a full sun. They love well draining soil, so they're great. I mean, we have prairie sage in our back alley. It's rocky, it's poor soil. It's thriving every year. It doubles in size. Loves it. No watering, nothing. It looks way better than the quackgrass that would otherwise be creeping everywhere. So beautiful, and they are deterrent to types of wildlife that we might not want in our gardens, like deer or hares. Because of their aromatic nature, a lot of animals are not going to be eating them or browsing them if that's a concern where you are living. And then they're wind pollinated, so they're not directly feeding pollinating insects, but Artemisia species are known to be important hosts for butterflies and moths. So remembering that, butterflies especially, they have different host plants than what they necessarily feed on. So if you're keen to support these type of insects, learn about that. So you don't just want pretty flowers, you do want grasses and wind pollinated plants, because they are important food for larval forms or immature forms of native insects. So yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, I feel like I'm just at the beginning of diving down into learning more about native insects, and it's just, I'm endlessly fascinated and amazed at what's going on. And again, native species are the best candidates because they've adapted these insects have adapted to native species, whereas non-native species may not be ever a suitable host. So these are concerns and thoughts to consider. Some native grasses. So we primarily specialize in clump forming native grasses because we are catering to gardens. A lot of the time we have a couple spreaders, but so blue gramagrass does spread a little bit by rhizome, but fairly slowly. So they're not aggressive grasses, is what I'm trying to say. These are two species that are utilized in lawn replacement strategies. Now, they're not the same as a lawn. You can't mow them all the time. The reason why is they're naturally short grasses, but when they do flower, you could cut them. But if you were actually to try and mow the blades, they wouldn't be that tolerant, and they wouldn't be that tolerant of being stepped on. So when I would talk about the idea of lawn replacement, first of all, you want to look at the laws in your municipality. So in Calgary, for example, it's illegal to have a lawn higher than 15 centimeters. So that actually excludes certain possibilities. Now, some people challenge those rules anyways, and bylaw officers are usually pretty lenient when it comes to native plants because they know how important that is. There's a good argument there. So I think really those bylaws are more there to help reduce weeds and unkept lawns, not to stop native prairies from coming in, but our native prairie replica garden lawns from coming in, but just something to be aware of. So, when we talk about native lawns, they're not going to be exactly the same, but if you're looking for low maintenance options that don't require watering, that are much better for the environment on multiple ways in terms of supporting wildlife, providing food for wildlife, then thinking about low growing grasses like this could be an option. Wild strawberry is a great option. I didn't include that in the slide, but those creeping plants like that spread by stolons or runners and are flat are great lawn replacements. Any of those ground cover type plants can become, sedums are used, not always native, but sedums are used as lawn replacements. So grasses and strawberries, silverweed, which is very similar to strawberry. Those are all possible candidates as if you're looking for a new setup that you don't have to mow, it doesn't have to be maintained in the same way. Some other beautiful clump forming native grasses, green needlegrass and Richardson needlegrass. So yes, there's different textures, colors, forms. I love Richardson's needlegrass. Those hanging seed heads are very, very pretty. So they are, again, grasses are wind pollinated, but they are important for providing host plants for different types of plants. And of course, in a grassland area, whether you're in a parkland or grassland ecoregion, grasses are the dominant species. So they're really critical to the health of the ecosystem. So it is really important to consider including them in a planting just to have a well-rounded garden space. We also use grasses because of their deep fibrous roots to help reduce soil erosion, and we strategically place them in gardens for that reason. The insects can really love to get in there and build homes and so forth. So it's always great to see that as well. We have little blue stem and needle and thread grass. Now, needle and thread grass has these really cute, interesting, curly seeds, or extensions of the seeds, if you will. And just be aware with the needle and thread grass that they do have, the seed is very sharp and can stick into your clothing or into animals' fur. So we do warn people about that before putting in needle and thread grass, although I absolutely love these grasses. They may not be ideal if you're going to have animals running through that area, or even small children who might get the seeds stuck in them. So it could be a good learning lesson as well, depending on your point of view. But the grasses I talked about before are all primarily full sun. So most of our grasses are full sun. For your area, you could also do a fringed brome, which I didn't put in the slide, but is native to the Lacombe area. And the fringed brome is a great alternative to that pesky introduced smooth brome. It's very pretty, long, dangly seed head, but does more of a moist part shade environment. Little blue stem, very, very pretty. And I love the seeds of little blue stem. You can see how cute and fluffy. I am a real sucker for any cute, fluffy plant. I think, I don't know, it gives them an animal-like feel. I really appreciate that. Little blue stem in the winter also provides winter interest. So these are just, you can see those nice reddish stalks. So various different, not just little blue stem, but grasses can be really lovely in providing a winter interest as well. You can leave the long blades of grass and then they can persist, and that can provide nice texture and interest when it seems so cold and dark and otherwise maybe just white with snow. And this is in the fall. This is from the nursery last year. Oops. You can see all the different color variations coming off of various native grass species. So some of our fescues are also evergreen too. So you want to, that's also really lovely. We love our fescues in our garden. It is so nice to just appreciate those in January when there's not much else going on. So. And climbers. So we have a number of climbing species. So I focus on Western Clematis, which is a white Clematis species, and native to Southern Alberta, but does well in a range of conditions. They do like a little bit more moisture and full sun, but probably handle a little bit of part shade as well, and they can get quite large and grow quite prolifically, and they're summer blooming. You can see those beautiful, gorgeous white blooms. And we also have a blue Clematis native to Alberta, which must be in the part shade, won't tolerate a full sun as well. But I didn't include that here. That one's more of a small plant that dies back on the wood. But the nice thing about Western Clematis, it grows back from the woody growth, so persists. So the photo on the left-hand side is from the Coot Center, and you can see there's like a pine tree. I'll use my mouse to indicate. Coot Center is near Nanton, and they're so called a center for Western Canadian heritage. And so they've got actually quite a number of plants that native plants originally from our company, and yeah, so they're quite interesting. Very nice site to visit. They have different events. I think they're owned by the University of Lethbridge now. You can see they've got these lovely arches, and this is a popular place for weddings and wedding photos. And so you can see, I've got another photo. These clematis, I asked the head gardener how old they are. They're about 10 or 15 years. So it does take time, but the nice thing is what I'm trying to say is that the leaves grow back from the woods. You can really get a beautiful dramatic look. You can see looking at all the arches together from the side, you can see how beautiful that is. So this was in the fall when they had gone to seed. You can imagine how gorgeous that was as well when they were flowering. So very, very pretty. So if you're really looking for making a big arch in your garden, think about white Western clematis as a possibility. Now we also have honeysuckle. So there are other climbing plants native to Alberta as well. The yellow paintbrush and red paintbrush. Red paintbrush is always a favorite because there's not that many bright red plants. Interesting fact with the paintbrush is the colored part isn't actually the flower, it's the bract associated with the flower. And these plants are really interesting. I'm really fascinated with them. Red paintbrush likes more moisture and more of a part shade environment. They grow more in a forested type area. And the yellow paintbrush is a prairie species. It's become quite, I would say it's more on the rare side, more atypical to find these because of the prairies are so disturbed and especially good quality prairie. So so the yellow ones definitely need a little bit of assistance. But what's really unique about these species is that they're what's called hemiparasitic. So they do actually directly parasitize other plants with their roots. And we actually have quite a few parasitic species native to Alberta. We don't grow any other ones. I don't think anyone else does. So there is like definitely a learning curve there to learn and understand how to grow parasitic species. Again, there's many native plants that no one is cultivating at all. So there's a real, again, so much room for learning and growth in this area. But we do really recommend planting them with a companion. So we do recommend grasses. There's a limited research on what hosts can be used, but they're generalist hosts. There are species of paintbrushes that exist that have only one specific host, and typically those plants are endangered because of that. I know there's islands around in the Pacific of Canada where there are very, very rare paintbrushes that have a very specific host, and scientists have yet been able to figure out what is their host to actually cultivate them in an artificial environment. So, there are always ongoing questions, but both these species are not too difficult to grow from seed. They do require cold stratification, and the seeds last an awfully long time considering how small they are and how fragile they seem. We have red paintbrush over 10 years old, growing, germinating really well still. So that's another really cool thing about these plants. And I find insects love them. When I go wild collecting seeds, I always find so much evidence of insect activity. So I know that they're really important and play a really important role in the ecosystem in that regard. Some unusual plants and more difficult to grow plants. We have the white clematis, really pretty. I love this species. It is poisonous as well. And we also have death camas in more dry prairie areas. White camas, again, you'll find more in the foothills and montane areas. And they do like a little bit more moisture. So if you have a garden with that type of environment, that's fine. They would do well, part shade to full sun. But we have some, once they're established, they're typically pretty good and don't need any supplemental water. What's tricky about these plants and plants in the lily family in general, so wood lily is another example. They're really slow growing, so it takes them a couple of years for the leaves to even fill in, and usually 5 to 7 years to actually flower. Same with the wild hollyhock. So these are plants that aren't going to bloom in your second year. So most perennials, you grow them from seed, and then they'll flower in their second year, typically second, maybe third year. But there are definitely species that require more time. These are examples of these. So the white camas does need a little bit more time, but once they do, it's well worth it. They have this beautiful, so pretty and so beautiful in a garden environment. So there's time, and that's things as a grower we have to factor it in. We're planning 2-3 years in advance just to have a sellable plant. So it's quite interesting. And then on the right-hand side, the wild hollyhock, this is actually a rare species in Alberta, and they get quite large. So unlike the introduced hollyhock or the cultivated hollyhock, which is biennial, these are long-lived perennials, and they also have fascinating seeds. The seeds are reputed, of course, I've never tested it myself, to live to be viable for 100 years, which is very interesting. But we have seeds from 2001 that have almost a 90% germination rate. So they really do have incredible longevity. These are seeds that were designed to, or evolved, if you will, to survive and to germinate after a fire. So yeah, they're native to sort of the southwest corner of Alberta, but they do really well in a garden environment. These plants have been staked, so they can be up to 6 feet tall, but their true growth form tends to be more of slightly ascending, so a bit more of a sprawling growth form rather than upright. So to get the effect of the biennial hollyhocks, and Alan Pat always, this is actually from Alan Pat's garden or side of their house, they always stake them to get that dramatic height. They have very large leaves. I know I said earlier, native plants often don't have wide leaves, but this is definitely an exception. So very large, up to 10 inches across. So yeah, very beautiful and dramatic species, very pretty. Okay, heart-leaved Alexander. So this is a plant in the carrot family. This is a prairie species that does well in part shade and full sun conditions. This plant is in the carrot family. We finally got this plant to germinate after 3 years of trying. Thing with carrot family plants is seeds do not, so certain families and certain groups tend in general not to have a long viability. So that's one challenge with the heart-leaved Alexander. The other thing is they are recommended to have up to 8 or 9 months of cold stratification. So, but then again, native plants are so fascinating because we grew some and we started stratifying them expecting 5 months. And they came 2 months earlier. They only needed 3 months. So even though, a study has been done and there's been, said this X recommendation, a different stand or a different population can be totally different. And that's, again, some of the challenges and excitement and adventure of growing native species is they haven't been bred by humans. They haven't been bred to be really predictable and dependable. They're diverse, they're variable. You can't always predict, you can't always plan. So it does make it challenging as a grower, but, as a life philosophy, it's fabulous because you have to go with the flow. And so it makes us, I think, more easygoing people in the long run. Now, this is also an edible species. You can eat the seeds and so forth. So I always give them a little nibble when I see them. They're not that, they're fairly common, but again, they're an indicator of rangeland health. So in a poorly managed rangeland, they may have completely disappeared. So there is a concern with this species as well in that regard. I really like Alpine Vistor. This is more of a moisture-loving alpine species, but they're really cool, and I always like talking about them. We don't often get requests for them, although they are a traditional food, so they do have an edible taproot. But what's unique about them is you can see there's the flowers on top of the spike, if you will, and below are these what are called bulbils. So the scientific name, Polygonum viviparum, and viviparum means live birth. So basically these little bulbils are like little bubbles of life, and they're alive basically. Like you'll often see them, they'll start germinating, right? So it's like live birth. So they basically clone themselves and replicate themselves that way. So it's not a seed at all, it's a bulbil. So that's really unique. And you can grow the plants from the bulbils and the seeds. They tend to actually reproduce themselves more by bulbils than by seeds. So the research says. So that's very interesting. They're a very small, fine plant that likes part shade environment. Yellow puccoon, I really love this species. The first time I ever saw them many years ago, I thought this isn't where this must be a weed. This is so unusual looking. This is so alien looking in the landscape. But they are in fact a native species, and they have, you know, one thing you get to appreciate when you are growing these plants is they have the most gorgeous bright red roots that you would never suspect or know unless you actually got to work with them. And they're also covered with these irritant hairs. So you have to be careful when handling them or transplanting them, or again, you know, which is great though. That would be a deterrent potentially to certain types of wildlife or unwanted things around, but you know, that's something really unique. They're summer blooming. They have these yellow flowers that are related to that Alpine forget-me-not. So what's really unique about them as well is they produce these pearly white seeds that are pyramidal shaped, and they look like, I like to think that they look like shark's teeth or pearls or beads. They're really, really unique. So there's many phases of this plant from flowering time to seed where you can really appreciate all the unique adaptations. This is a full sun. They can, I would say, to some part sun, so sun to part sun. And you can see anytime a plant has whitish hairs on them, that's usually an adaptation to sun damage, so to help protect them from UV rays. So look for those features for plants that really are resistant to strong sun. But yeah, anyways, and then well draining soil, of course, and you often see them on slopes and things, and you're driving down, you know, we often see little prairie remnants on the side of the road, on the side of a field that's just the roadside, and we will collect from that type of area. And we often see yellow cocoon, seems to like to grow on different slopes. A silver sagebrush. So this is related to those other sage plants I was talking about earlier, the fringed. And I know it's a lot of, you don't have to remember them all. So I'm hoping you'll just take home a few and remember a few. But this is another Artemisia species, so related to the fringed and prairie sages, so aromatic. But this is a true shrub. So unlike being a sub shrub, this is a true shrub. It's sometimes evergreen, sometimes not. We also have, we don't have any in stock, but we also carry big leaf sagebrush, which is also native to the southwest corner of Alberta. And that plant is totally evergreen. And I absolutely love seeing that plant in our garden in the winter because you get those beautiful silvery green leaves 365 days of the year. But with the silver sagebrush, which is more common, if you've been to Drumheller, there's tons of it there. That's the type of environment. It likes very poor soil, it can be clay, can be sandy, you know, they very extraordinarily drought tolerant, and alkaline tolerant as well. This is the type of species that should be planted, you know, on the side of the road instead of some of the species that are chosen, because they can handle the road salting that we do, and then they can handle that high salt. The high salt content. So that's type of species because that's the kind of environment that they've adapted to live in. So you know, think of how fascinating and beautiful our boulevards could be if we utilize some of these species that are actually adapted to that type of to the roadway environment, like the high salt and low precipitation environment. So that, you know, that's my dream for the future. But anyways, they are true shrubs. So they get probably about 3 to 4 feet tall, and can spread out again to a similar type of width. On the right hand side, you can see the flowers. They are wind pollinated like other sages, but they're very pretty. And some more subshrubs from that. This is also from the native to the Drumheller area. So really adapted to, very tolerant of high salt in the soil and drought and poor soil conditions, is the winter fat. So named because it's actually a really great forage for horses or livestock, or of course native animals as well. So they can be a source of winter food. So that's why the name winter fat comes from. There are male and female flowers on the plant, and as a subshrub, that means that some years they die back from the wood doesn't persist, and some years they persist. So you get kind of a back and forth. Some, you know, I've seen some old ones in Drumheller, they have quite a strong woody base. So obviously they're persisting. There's a certain part of their wood that does persist every year. So as they mature, that can happen as well. You know, I just had a look at our overwintered plants. Some of them kept their leaves and some of them didn't. So It will vary, but again, they have those beautiful, they look very similar to the silver sagebrush in the having those silvery narrow leaves. Again, that's an adaptation to the sun. And they're very, very pretty. Another plant that is a subshrub is a rubber rabbit brush. It has a funny name, Ericameria nauseosus, and you would think, oh, nausea, that's not good. But actually, they're not poisonous, and they are another important forage species. And this is one where settlers, when they came, they must have thought that it wasn't good, and they tried to eradicate it from their fields. But Indigenous people were using it to feed their horses, and it actually is really good for winter food for livestock. So it doesn't need to be, shouldn't be eradicated. They have beautiful, they're late blooming yellow flowers, and they're in the aster family and the daisy family. So that type of family tends to have, always has really a shallow flower. So if you're looking for diverse types of flower, this is one. This is a very unique species with these needle-like leaves. It's very unlike many plants you may have seen. So they're quite unique. Soapweed yucca, or some people say yucca. I say yucca because the yucca, it's a long story. I won't go too much, but it's an indigenous word from South America, yucca, which refers to the yucca, actually the cassava root. So that was misnamed. So these yuccas, Yucca glauca, was misnamed by Carl Linnaeus. So that's where the yucca comes from. That's why I say yucca, because I traveled in South America and I got fond of the way of pronouncing the word yucca, but most people here say yucca. And so this is a very beautiful species as well. Very drought tolerant, but slow growing. So if you want a yucca this big, you're going to have to wait about 10 years. Very drought tolerant once established, and they have a thick tap root. Their native range is all the way down into Mexico. And so there's a lot of archaeological sites that have different ways that the yucca was used. So their fibers were used to make sandals. The root has a lot of saponins, is very soapy. It was used in a soap-like way, or could be used in a soap-like way. But then the fruits are edible, actually. But it's very rare to see it fruit. If you planted it, it would be too far north to see it fruit. The native range is actually the south eastern part of the province. And so, maybe Cypress Hills type area around there. And that's the furthest north. And what's really unique about this species is it has an exclusive moth host. There's a couple species of moths. So yucca and the moths that exclusively pollinated. So without those moths, the pollination rate of the flowers is like 3%, is from a study I've seen, something like that. So very, very low. And then when you have the moths present, it goes up to about 90%. So you have amazing pollination rates with these moths. But the moths also lay their larvae on the yucca, and then they eat the seeds. So that's really, really fascinating. It's a really unique, beautiful adaptation. Now, both the moths and this yucca are federally regulated as endangered in Canada. And so there's not a lot of them, but you can definitely plant them. And our seeds actually don't necessarily come from Alberta. We'll get them from Montana, because we're not going to be necessarily harvesting on these very rare sites. But they do really well if you have sandy, well-draining soil and want something very interesting. Again, we can have very interesting looking type gardens if we incorporated some of these really unique species and had the patience to let them get to these really large and dramatic sizes. Another really interesting species, prickly pear cactus. So also really they like sandy, well-draining soil. They could also be a ground cover. They can spread, but definitely not one you could be stepping on. And you can see how gorgeous. The flowers are either bright yellow or bright pink. The genus is Apuntia, and they are the same genus as the edible prickly pear, if you've ever seen that at the grocery store. So you can eat the fruits. But like the imported prickly pear fruit, the seeds are very large, so you cannot chew them. You'd have to swallow them whole. I've eaten the fruit. I didn't find them super sweet, but it was an interesting experience, that's for sure. And they spread really well vegetatively. So if you decided you want to have lots of them or give them as gifts to friends, it would be very easy to just pull off a pad, they detach quite easily. It's by design, if you will, or by evolutionary design in the plant. The pads will just fall off really easily and root themselves, immediately root, right? And if you're familiar with rooting succulents, it's the same idea. So you can absolutely do that with a prickly pear. There are 3 species of cactus native to Alberta. We only carry the prickly pear cactus. I think there are other vendors out there that might have some of the other species. And the flowers are very aromatic, but you definitely have to get on your hands and knees, get in there to smell them. But I always do when I see them, because it's such a treat to smell such a beautiful fragrance. So yeah, that's the prickly pear. And we have other succulents as well. We have native sedums. I don't think I put sedums in the slide. We have so many species. We have nearly 200 species that we carry, but you can get plants, and the sedums are the same, the native sedums. You break a piece off and they start to root, so they can really easily fill a garden bed. So it's really unique. You definitely have to put prickly pear in a full sun environment. If you don't, they won't thrive. They won't grow fast. It does take time. They're slow. We've been growing them from seed. Takes a couple of years. I'd say 2 to 3 years before they will do much if you grow them from seed. So they're very slow, but once they're established there, they spread like wildfire. So something to be aware of. Tricky to weed. Those spines hurt, believe me. So you want to wear gloves, thick leather gloves, if you're weeding between a prickly pear cactus. And you can also put them in a pot, right? This type of species would do really well in a pot as well. Just make sure you add sand as an amendment to your potting medium, or other, large particles that are well draining. Bearberry, another ground cover. This is a full sun to part shade, fairly slow growing. You could irrigate if you want to help support growth and the speed of growth. But this is a plant that's already established in conventional horticulture, so it's already a very popular species and does look very beautiful in a garden bed as an alternative ground cover. They're evergreen as well, so that's another thing. They do bring winter interest. When they're not covered in snow, of course, and they tend to turn bright red purple. That's by virtue of the anthocyanins in the plant bind with sugar, and it acts as an antifreeze. So that's enables them to be evergreen, and that's why they turn purple in the winter. Another evergreen as well as a ground cover are pussy toes. I chose here white pussy toes. This is from the Coot Center. I love it. They have a rock wall. Probably about 20, 15 meters across, and they have white pussy toes planted all the way through it, and it looks really gorgeous. So you could definitely play with different textures when you use different pussy toes. We have white pussy toes. We have white pussy toes is the most drought tolerant. It's a prairie species that makes these big round flat circles. You may have seen them, and they can withstand a certain amount of foot traffic if you're looking to use them in that way. But the flower heads do have a bit of height. They're also called everlastings because even after they finish flowering, the bracts of the flowers, the bracts are any appendage associated with a flower, they persist. So people use them in flower arrangements for that reason, but they give a look of having flowers for a very long time, even though the flowers have already finished blooming and going to seed. Then we have rosy pussy toes. They like a bit more moisture and a bit more, they can do a bit more part shade. We have field pussy toes, the same thing. They like a little bit more, they're more of a forest species, but they don't, rather than having that whitish upper surface, they have a green upper surface and a white under surface. So they provide a beautiful texture. So yeah, there's different types of effects and colors you can get using the pussy toes, and that would be also a potential lawn replacement type environment if you weren't going to be over. Again, they can handle some foot traffic, but not as much as a traditional lawn. Some shrubs. I want to. Oops, sorry. I had more than one name there, but just one. Canada buffalo berry. So as I said at the beginning, if you remember, buffalo berries flower very early, and they're male and female plants. So this on the left-hand side, that's a male buffalo berry, Shepherdea canadensis is the scientific name. So the males, those are going to be great providing pollen resources and food for early insects. So they were already blooming in April. They bloom before the leaves. So actually these flowers are pretty much done. The leaves have already started to come out. But both the male and female flowers have nectaries. So if you can sort of see these enlarged yellow discs, that's they're shiny, those are the nectaries. Those are the organs that produce nectar and provide food resources to native insects. And if you are raising honeybees as well, obviously any of these nectar bearing plants would be beneficial to those type of insects as well. This is the growth form. So you get this really nice rounded shape. They're very versatile. They grow in the prairies, they grow in more forested areas. And they don't get super huge generally. They tend to be a smaller, nice round shrub. And the females produce bright red fruits that are ripe in late July typically. And those are really important traditional foods. They have a lot of saponins, and they're very soapy. So they produce what's often called as an Indian ice cream. Basically, you add berries with the water and you whip them, and it foams up like whipping cream. The texture is quite similar. It's bitter, so it's different than what the typical Western diet is used to. But they're fun. I like to play with it with the desserts and just add a little bit for color and texture. Not a lot because the taste wise they are bitter, but I think once sometimes you get used to them and you really like them. So I know I usually can handle eating quite a few of their berries now. Dwarf birch and red osier dogwood, so some other shrubs we carry. Dwarf birch, very underutilized species. Ken Wright, if you're not too far from you folks, you might find Wright Nursery. If you're looking for more native shrubs, Ken Wright from Wright Nurseries does some fabulous work, and he is an absolute expert. Ken Wright is an absolute expert of native shrubs in Alberta. Over 30 years experience. He could be retired, but can't stop growing. And he says, so his pitch for dwarf birch is it's the native cotoneaster replacement. And cotoneasters are notorious for getting scale and other insect diseases. And they're pruned, but they're not really meant to be pruned. They're actually kind of a gangly. If you look at the ones they're also an escapee, so they're starting to encroach on native habitat. They're not neat looking, but people prune them and then they get sick and they're never do that well. But dwarf birch has a perfect round form, and even though sometimes they're called bog birch, you see them in boggy, moist areas. They're actually if you collect seed from drought tolerant plants, which is what we do, then they're actually also very drought tolerant. So don't be fooled by the fact that you see them in moist areas. They're very versatile and can be fully established and not require any additional irrigation in an area. But yeah, so the cotoneaster, but what would be a much better, they could be hedges, they could be rounded shrubs, and they would actually stay in that form and wouldn't need to be excessively pruned. So that's your dwarf birch. They're so cute. They're adorable. And the red osier dogwood, I put a winter picture just to give you, this one is a fairly commonly planted species, but it has gorgeous winter interest because of the very bright red bark. And so there are other species like that. You could select willows as well, can have very beautiful winter bark, whether they be bright pink or orangey pink and that kind of thing. So thinking about shrubs are really helpful for if you're looking to create winter interest gardens and you want to utilize the woody parts as highlights. I wanted to put in some night flowering plants. Butte primrose, one of our favorites, blooms this is one of our few perennials that blooms in the first year. They are native to the southwest corner of Alberta. They like full sun and well-draining soil. They have massive white blooms. They're very ephemeral, so they start blooming in the evening to attract moth pollinators, and then by the next morning they start to turn pink. So they're very short-lived and prolific bloomer. Often we'll get a spring bloom and a fall bloom. This is one of our very popular species because the blooms are so large. and it is such a prolific bloomer for such a small plant. On the right-hand side, you have the yellow evening primrose, which is biennial to short-lived perennial. And again, I really want to promote the idea of night flowering plants. Anything in the evening primrose family, hence the name, typically is night flowering. They're so important for moth pollinators, which is the main food source for bats, which are in decline. So if you are looking to promote bats in your area or on your property, do consider including some native night flowering plants as well to support their key food. And the government of Alberta has some great resources as well for choosing plants suitable for supporting moth habitat and promoting bat recovery. Okay, so I have some late flowering plants, pleated gentian. I love this plant. And very pretty, bright blue. I feel like the pictures we take just never seem to do this plant justice. They're just such a beautiful blue, royal blue, a shorter plant. And they like a little bit more moisture, but otherwise, so what we do when we put them in our garden, and we say they want a little bit more moisture, we have a slightly sloped bed and we just put them at the bottom. So they're just getting a little bit more of that water runoff. That does seem to be just enough to give them enough irrigation. We don't need to water them, and they always bloom in August. Meadow blazing star, this would be native to your area. So this is the dotted blazing stars native to my area. I love the blazing stars. They're late flowering, so important for pollinating insects. So they're like the cleome, the bee plant. They have a long bloom time, an indefinite bloom time, new blooms towards the top, older flowers towards the bottom, and they can bloom for quite a long period of time. So I think 3 to 5 weeks, which is quite long bloom time for a lot of plants. And this is a late summer, even into September. So that's really, again, really important for different wildlife who need those resources when resources are scarce. So the meadow blazing star likes a little bit more moisture and will do really well in your area. In my area, it's a shorter lived perennial because we're a bit too dry here. But in your area, you get more moisture, so it'd be great. And it's taller. So I don't have a full picture of the meadow blazing star, but that's about 1 to 2 feet tall versus the dotted blazing star is less than 1 foot. So they're both liatris species. And you may have seen Liatris spicata. That's native to Eastern Canada and is popularly cultivated and planted. Yellow prairie coneflower, and we also have some red ones. So that's a little bit of a cultivar, if you will, of the native one. Red is a natural variant of the yellow prairie coneflower, but we have obtained some seed saved specifically from red plants. So just playing a little bit with that. We don't want to cultivate too much. Again, we don't want to put too much selection pressure. We want them to be tough. We want them to survive without any support. We want, I'm all for plants that are self-sustaining. I do not want to babysit them. I do not want a garden that I have to babysit. I want them all to be tough. So, but yeah, we did highlight some of the red ones and have seed for that this year. These are fairly easy to grow from seed, full sun, and they're summer blooming plants. Summer, I say July, August. Showy aster, another late bloomer. This plant gets quite tall when they get moisture. So they do like moisture, but are, again, still drought tolerant if you don't have them in a super moist spot. And they're very late blooming. So I've seen them blooming even into October if the season is warm enough. And so you can see this is anything in the daisy family has those nice shallow nectaries. A lot of our asters are late blooming, or what used to be known as asters, even though the scientific names have changed. So the white prairie aster and the smooth aster, August, these are all August and into September blooming, and they have fairly long bloom times. These are really easy to grow plants. White prairie aster is more of a creeping plant, or ascending, I would say. So it's not totally flat on the ground, but just low and spreading. And the smooth aster is more of a tall erect plant, and it is about 2 feet-ish, maybe, up to 3 in some cases, or a little bit shorter. And then the former showy aster looks similar, but the showy aster actually has much wider, hairier leaves and is a little bit taller in the right conditions. Some more late bloomers. Now, goldenrods are also very notorious for being great for pollinating insects as well, with their long bloom periods, late bloom times as well, and prolific flower production. Oh my God, like one plant just produces so many flowers. So we have, I think, 5 species that or maybe 6 that we carry, but I highlighted the stiff goldenrod, which is a clump forming one of the only clump forming goldenrods, and very pretty, and looks quite different than the other 4 that we have in our collection. I love the stiff goldenrods. This is a native prairie species. The mountain and prairie will also grow in prairie environments as well. And they don't spread, like I would say the mountain goldenrod doesn't spread very much, but does spread a little bit. And the prairie goldenrod can spread quite a bit. But they're short. They're probably about less than a foot tall. And they're full sun plants. They really like the sun, and yeah, they do really, really well. So if you're looking for a really tenacious plant that can handle, you want to fill in some space, and you want to spread, and you want a burst of yellow in late season, then prairie goldenrod would be a great choice. If you're looking just to highlight, you want a clump forming plant, then go with a stiff goldenrod. But stiff goldenrod, yeah, they're so pretty. And so I just wanted to highlight her. I know we're already, I'll go quickly the last little bit because I wanted to have time for questions. But I wanted to look at a couple edible species as well. Many of our native plants are traditional edible plants. So I wanted to highlight a couple of my favorites. So wild licorice is more for tea. It is related to the European licorice that licorice flavor comes from. This is a plant that spreads. They like dry to moist conditions, full sun to park shade, so quite versatile. And they do provide winter interest because their seed heads turn like a burgundy orange, and they do have hooks on them, so they stick to your clothes. So not great if you're going to be walking through them because they stick to you, but just aesthetically, they persist all winter and are very pretty. But it would be the root that you use. So obviously with a plant like that, it would take you a few years. You want to plant them, want to grow a good patch before you collect your roots. I have had the tea of the roots. It's a nice, mild flavored. It's not as sweet as the European licorice, but still really fun. Ground plum is a prairie edible legume, and the legume fruits are big and round like plums, like small plums. Of course, they taste like peas because it's in the pea family, but really neat. We didn't irrigate our plants last year and it was dry, and haven't gotten fruit yet. I'm waiting. So I'm hoping this year my plants will flower and they will fruit. And so I can report back what exactly they taste like, because I've yet to actually eat ground plum. And so, keep in mind with some of these edible perennials, you might incorporate them in your garden, but keep in mind it might take a few years before they start to bear fruit. Bee balm, beautiful summer blooming plant in the mid family, very aromatic, tastes exactly like oregano but stronger. So I use it in lieu of oregano and thyme all the time in my cooking. And also wonderful for pollinating insects and hummingbirds as well. They can do full sun to part shade. Giant hyssop is native to your area, and it has a faint flavor of anise or fennel, also in the mint family. And my goodness, the number of bees buzzing around our plants last year, I just couldn't believe it. And they got to be about over 4 feet tall. So they're quite tall, the giant hyssops. Like the name, giant hyssop, they really are giants. And yeah, very pretty. And they make a lovely tea, but it's quite mild. So, if you like a little bit of anise, you can try the leaves for tea. We of course have wild mints. We do like moist environments, but once they're established, they spread very well like other mints. And they're more of like a spearmint flavor. So they're not like peppermint. They don't have menthol, but they still have more of a spearmint type flavor, and they're really lovely. I use them in cooking and tea all the time, and I love it. What was our native onions, and we do, they reproduce themselves by bulbs, and we kind of have eaten them. If you get a good patch of them, please don't harvest them from the wild. They take so long to grow. But in the garden, you can divide the bulbs and get a good patch and eat them like shallots. It's really fun. thing to do. You know, and beware, we always keep they do need cold stratification to germinate. We always keep our onion seeds away from our other plants because we have found that they do inhibit germination of other species. So a very interesting adaptation of the onions there. Some more fruit-bearing plants you might be aware of that are native. So Saskatoon, wild red raspberry, and golden currant. We have various species of currant and gooseberries. So they're gooseberries and currants are in the same genus, Ribes. And the difference between them is that currants don't have thorns. Now, native currants and gooseberries don't always produce fruit every year. It depends on the species. I find that the golden currant seems to produce every year, but maybe the gooseberries that at least that I'm familiar with don't. So just something to be aware of, but they're one of my most favorite wild fruits. I just love the burst of flavor. I find them really delicious and it's such a treat because they don't always produce. I know this is another species of buffalo berry, the silver buffalo berry, much larger than the Canada buffalo berry, and the fruits are more palatable, I think, to the Western diet. They have more of a tangy, sweet flavor. They're really yummy, and also called bullberries. And traditionally, people would bang the branches with sticks because it's pretty hard to get the fruit off, and then have like something, maybe you could put a cloth underneath or a tarp to catch the fruits, and that's how you would collect them quickly. Otherwise, it's very labor intensive to pull each of the fruits off. They are fruits do persist into the winter as well. So definitely one of my favorite native fruits, very underappreciated. If you're familiar with sea buckthorn, which is in the same family, the Eleaginaceae family, it's a little bit similar, but not as oily as that type of fruit. And I should have said as well, all of the plants in this family, including the other buffalo berry, are also nitrogen fixing, but they use a unique bacteria found only in native soils. So something to be aware of. And then you can see the beautiful early blooms. And this is a honeybee. This was from in Calgary a couple of years ago. I saw this beautiful blooming silver buffalo berry. And then nettles, I love seeing nettle. In our area, it's actually slender nettle, Urtica gracilis, but use it exactly the same as common nettle. And this is my first green of the season, my first green vegetable. I always eat nettles. And a very interesting fact about nettles, they're the main host of some gorgeous butterflies, including the Milgard's tortoiseshell, the preferred host. So, and this year, Ben just saw some morning cloak, another really gorgeous butterfly in our yard. And I'm wondering, did they lay their eggs in the nettle? Because that particular group of butterflies and its relatives, that's their favorite place to lay their eggs is nettle, which is so smart, right? Because who wants to touch nettle, right? Use gloves when harvesting. Once you cook the leaves, they don't sting anymore. Fireweed, again, a really tenacious plant, very tough. Can handle a lot of different conditions. It's an early colonizing species, so it's disturbance tolerant. I like to make Ivan's chai, which is a Eastern European recipe of, it's the same way you would make a black tea from a green tea leaf. So, you know, green tea and black tea come from the same plant, but black tea is oxidized. So this is the same process. You wilt the leaves, you crush the leaves in balls, like in the picture, you let them oxidize and ferment for 24 to 72 hours. I check them every morning and night. Once they turn dark brown to black and become very aromatic and sweet flavor, I stick them in the oven at the lowest temperature to dry them. And you get this really lovely aromatic tea called Ivan's chai, not commercially available in Canada at all, but a traditional recipe from Eastern Europe that has been made for centuries. And it's really interesting how the process of oxidation and some mild fermentation, it's mainly oxidation, but there is a little bit of fermentation. So oxidation is just you're breaking open the contents of the cell, and when exposed to oxygen, different chemical reactions occur that bring out all these flavors that are not present in the plant, just like black tea tastes so different than a green tea. So it's a really fun thing to do, really interesting. And again, the reason why is because some of these species grow across the Northern Hemisphere, and that's one of these examples. So you can find lots of different unique uses, traditional uses across the world. So I'll get it for all the plants. Now I just want to tell you a little bit more. I'll give you a little bit more information before I about us before I take questions. So here's our native plant database. We took a lot of time and care to put this together. So all of our plants are on the database, and you can see you can search by different parameters, whether it's full sun. That's the light conditions, the moisture conditions, the bloom time. You can search by all those parameters. And then each plant has a profile. Most of them have pictures. We're working on it because all the pictures we've taken ourselves. That's why it's taking time, because we didn't want to steal anyone else's pictures. We wanted to use our own pictures. So, we've got the common names. So ALCLA borealis is actually the new accepted name in Canada. So but we haven't changed it in our database yet. So we have some of the different scientific names you might find, and some of the new names that taxonomists have put in to distinguish, from European species from North American species, even though they look the same. Genetically, they're a little bit different. We have different, whether they're edible, whether they're, how they grow. So growth habit, whether they're rhizomatous, this plant spreads. So to help you select the type of plant that you might want, and different categories like annual. Forbs means wildflowers, and grasses and shrubs. So this is just to help people select plants and design plants for their environment without, even though they might not know very much about the plants. And then we have also a seed store that we launched this year. All of this is available on our website. You can see we have a selection of plants that we have seeds for, and then you can click on a plant and we have specific information. So giant hyssop generally requires about 1 month stratification. That was what we found with this particular seed lot. So that's what we put on the packet, and the number of seeds and any other relevant information you might find there. So most of the seeds are collected in Alberta. In this particular case, I think we hadn't been able to collect seed that year, so we did get some sourced from Manitoba. So that's why otherwise you would see Alberta sourced. So that's it for me. And so if you have any questions, you can get in touch. Another great resource, if you're keen to know about native species, is the Alberta Native Plant Council. Edmonton also has a native plant group as well, and they're very active. So get in touch with those folks if there's a lot more promotion going on nowadays about cultivating native species. So you can get a lot of support for different projects that way. So I will take questions now. I don't know if Mike is around here, if he wants to facilitate, or do you have a chat box I can just go through?
Yeah, you bet. I think there are a few in the chat box. So there are a couple here from Peggy. Are the wild hollyhocks different from prairie mallow?
Yes, yeah. So they're in the same family. Did you say prairie mallow?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. So they're very different. Yeah. So the little mallows that grow in the prairie are small little plants, and then this is much larger, bigger plant, but they're in the same family. So the mallow family.
Then Peggy had another one. What plant were you making tea from?
Fireweed. Well, I made so many. I mean, bee balm, giant hyssop, wild mint, and then the fireweed tea. I do a bit more of a processed tea, and there's also wild chamomile, which is introduced from BC. You've probably seen it because people think it's a weed, but it is native. A wild chamomile makes a fabulous tea. If you like chamomile, it tastes exactly like chamomile.
Marty has one here. Could you cold stratify by placing the seed in a snowbank?
Yeah, I would, rather than put them in a snowbank, I would just plant them outside, either in a pot or on the ground, and that's natural cold stratification. Absolutely. If you are planting in a pot, I guess it's analogous to the snowbank. Pile snow on top of it. It is helpful because you want to make sure, because pots are not in the ground, the plants could dry out a little bit more quickly than plants in the ground. So the biggest issue in the dormant season is total drying out, and And that's what you want to mitigate. You don't want the roots to totally dry out. So yeah, definitely keep them in the snow, keep them frozen as long as possible, and that does improve their survivability or their. Oh, I got totally derailed there. I was like, I went from seeds to growing plants in pots. Sorry.
That's okay. I think we'll cut you some slack, Latifa. You've been going for almost 2 hours now.
Thanks, Mike.
Does your database list hardiness zones?
No, and that's also because that information isn't established for native plants, but the best thing to do instead, if you're concerned, I would look at, I mean, some of the more common ones will have hardiness, like I'm sure you could find hardiness zones for bee balm and things like that. You know, we don't try and calculate that in the plants, but think more about your ecological niche. And I think yeah, I would, you want to think more about sun and moisture. I think moisture is really more critical. Many of these plants do really well in the cold environment and can resist the frost. So anything we've grown, we've trialed, we've seen that it survives. And we have clients across the province and into Saskatchewan, and you know, we haven't had too many issues, but there will always be some local variation, right? So those are things to sort of think about, if that makes sense.
For sure. Another question, just wondering where they can find you, and can they visit in person? And just some information about how to get plants from you guys.
Yeah, so you can get in touch by email or phone. That's the easiest way. We do ship plants. So we ship plants anywhere in Canada, but mainly obviously in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And then, but you can also visit the nursery. So just make an appointment. Because we're small, we only have appointments on Wednesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays. But you know, now is a great time if you're keen to visit, because we typically will be, you know, by the time June rolls around, we get pretty full. So yeah, you know, give us some advance notice if you're coming down, and we allot people an hour, so we book them in for an hour, so we have lots of time to ask questions, and myself or Ben will be available to help you select plants and to answer any questions that you have.
Hey, great. Some questions about how the recording will be available. So as long as I didn't mess anything up on my end, we should post that on our website at lacombecounty.com. And then obviously, given the context of our conversation, I will just put a quick plug in for the county's Wild About Bees campaign that is selling native plant mixes. So some of the plants that were in Latifa's presentation, I see are in the seed mix, except we do need to add some night flowering species. So an evening primrose or something like that in there. I see that it's missing. So again, that information is online as well. But I'm not seeing too many more questions in the chat. Latifa, did you have any closing remarks?
Well, you know, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You know, we're happy to be there and to support your projects. And yeah, I mean, I know it's a lot of information, so let it filter through, and feel free to get in touch with me. This is best email address to get a hold of me if you do have any questions later. Yeah.
Well, I think that seems to be wrapping things up. Thank you so much for your time tonight, Latifa. We appreciate it, and thank you to everyone for participating. We will certainly look at doing something like this again, because this was very well attended, and we'd like to continue working with you in the future, Latifa.
Thanks so much, Mike. And I'm so happy to hear about the pollinator initiative. That sounds awesome.